Police officers shot and killed Ronda Rousey's daughter. No one could have imagined how her rage would unfold. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. The late afternoon sun slanted across the quiet neighborhood streets, painting the sidewalks in amber and bronze. The lamps along the road had not yet flickered on, but already the air felt heavy with the stillness of evening. Children's laughter from earlier recess hours had faded into silence. The schoolyard 2 blocks away stood empty, its chain-link fence catching the light like a dull net. Down the sidewalk walked a girl no older than 14, her pale hair shining as if woven from sunlight, her small shoulders weighed down by a sports bag too large for her frame. Inside lay her judo gi, freshly folded alongside her textbooks. She was tired from the long school day, but her face still carried a trace of determination. This was Lacey, the daughter of Ronda Rousey, a child who had grown up surrounded by stories of strength and resilience. A child who dreamed that someday she too would step onto the mat as confidently as her mother once had. Her steps were brisk but light, her sneakers tapping against the cracked pavement. In her head, she was rehearsing what she would say to her mother once she got home. She wanted to tell her about the math test she had aced, about the moment in gym class when she had managed to flip one of the taller boys who doubted her. She imagined Rhonda's proud smile, that half smirk that always meant she approved, even if she didn't want to show too much emotion. Lacey clutched the strap of her bag tighter, the corner of her mouth twitching in the ghost of a smile. For her, the evening seemed like any other quiet, ordinary, the kind of day that blended into the thousands of others of growing up. But behind her, the low purr of an engine disturbed the silence. She glanced back and saw a patrol car creeping along the curb. The car's glossy surface reflected the dying light, its red and blue bar on top resting dormant for now. 2 figures sat inside, shadows framed by glass. Lacey looked away quickly and kept walking, telling herself not to pay attention. After all, she had done nothing wrong. Still, a twinge of unease prickled the back of her neck. Her mother always warned her to be careful, to be respectful but firm, to avoid confrontation with strangers, especially men in uniform who too often saw threats where none existed. The patrol car slowed even more, then stopped. The metallic squeak of doors echoed in the empty street as 2 officers stepped out. They were both tall, broad men, one with a shaved head and the other with a thick mustache that shadowed his mouth. Their boots crunched against the asphalt as they walked toward her. "Hey," the bald one called, his voice carrying a note of command that made her freeze. "Where you heading, kid?" Lacey turned reluctantly. "Home," she answered softly, her voice steadier than she felt. The mustached officer smirked. "That's so? And what's in the bag?" He gestured with his chin toward her sports bag, his hand already sliding into his pocket to pull out a phone. He began to film, the red recording light blinking. "My school things," she said. She shifted the strap higher on her shoulder, trying not to let her irritation show. "School things, huh?" The bald one stepped closer. "Pretty big bag for just books. Why don't you show us what's inside?" Her heart picked up. She had heard stories like this before, whispered by her mother when she thought Lacey wasn't listening. Stories about officers who demanded compliance, who twisted words, who found excuses to escalate. Lacey's throat felt dry, but she swallowed and tried to keep her tone calm. "It's just my books and uniform. I really need to get home," she said. "Uniform?" The mustached officer chuckled, pointing the phone closer to her face. "What kind of uniform? You some kind of soldier?" His mocking tone stung. "Judo," she replied. "It's for training." "Judo, huh? Hear that?" He glanced at his partner, laughing under his breath. "She's a little fighter. Gotta watch out. Might flip us if we're not careful." The bald one leaned in so close she could smell the coffee on his breath. "Why don't you open the bag then, fighter? Let's make sure you're not hiding anything." She clutched the strap tighter. "It's just clothes. Please, I want to go home." The phone came even closer, capturing the fear in her eyes. The mustached officer's grin widened. "She doesn't want to show us. Maybe she's got something to hide. What do you think?" "I think she's being disrespectful," the bald one replied, "acting like she's too good to listen." He reached out suddenly and grabbed her shoulder. Lacey stumbled backward, her heart hammering. She could feel her throat tighten with panic. "Stop!" she cried, but her voice sounded small in the empty street. She looked around for help, but the houses stood silent, their curtains drawn. The street was deserted except for the three of them and the ever-watching eye of the phone camera. The mustached officer laughed louder. "Look at that, she's scared. We're just asking a question, sweetheart. Why you acting guilty?" The bald officer shoved her again, harder this time, until she backed against the cold surface of a brick wall. Her books tumbled from the bag, scattering across the sidewalk. Her white judo gi slipped out and fell into the dirt, its once clean fabric collecting grime. She bent quickly to gather her things, but the bald officer kicked one of the books away. The mustached one filmed her fumbling, his voice dripping mockery. "Look at her, folks! Future champion right here! Can't even hold on to her school bag." Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had promised herself she would never let bullies see her cry. Not in school, not in life. She stood up straight, clutching what few books she had managed to hold, and faced them. "Please," she said again, her voice low, controlled, though her chest felt tight. "I just want to go home." The bald officer's face hardened. "She's got an attitude." He grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back. She winced in pain, the sharp angle biting into her shoulder. "Stop resisting," he barked, though she wasn't resisting at all. "I'm not," she began, but her words were cut short by the cold press of steel. The second officer had drawn his gun, holding it low but unmistakably aimed in her direction. His grin had vanished, replaced by something darker, more dangerous. The street seemed to hold its breath. Even the birds had gone quiet. Lacey's heart pounded in her ears, her voice caught somewhere between a scream and silence. She thought of her mother, of the training sessions, of the times Ronda had told her. Always stay calm. Never give them a reason. She thought of her dream to stand on a podium one day, to hear the crowd cheer her name. And then, before she could form another thought, before she could even move, a deafening crack split the air. The bullet struck, and the world tilted. Her books scattered once more as her body crumpled to the ground. The pale strands of her hair spread across the dark asphalt, a halo touched with crimson. The two officers stood over her, one lowering his weapon, the other still recording, their faces unreadable. The camera caught it all, the confusion, the sudden stillness, the way her chest no longer rose and fell. Far away, footsteps pounded against the pavement. Another figure was coming, a figure who would shatter the fragile silence and turn grief into fury. But for now, the street remained suspended in a terrible quiet, broken only by the faint hum of the patrol car's engine and the red blink of a recording phone. The echo of the gunshot still hung in the air, refusing to fade as quickly as it should have. It lingered like smoke, heavy and suffocating, searing itself into the silence of the street. The sound had already reached further corners of the neighborhood, rattling through closed windows and settling in the hearts of those who pretended not to hear. Lacey lay motionless on the ground, her pale hair spread out across the asphalt, strands matted with blood that crept in slow rivulets toward the gutter. Her sports bag was overturned, its contents scattered, a half-open notebook fluttering in the breeze, a math textbook bent at the spine, the white folds of her judo gi stained by dirt and dust. The scene was wrong in every way. This was not a battlefield, nor the aftermath of a robbery. It was an empty residential street where a child had been walking home with her school things, and now she would never walk home again. The bald officer stood frozen for a moment, his arm rigid from the recoil of the gun. Then he lowered the weapon with a shaky exhale, his face already shifting into the practiced expression of justification. "She went for me," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for his partner to hear, but quiet enough to seem like he was talking to himself. "She resisted. I thought she had something." The mustached officer never stopped filming. His phone remained trained on the small body on the ground, his mouth curling into a twisted semblance of a smirk, though his eyes betrayed unease. "You're on camera," he said to his partner in a hushed tone. "You heard what she said. You saw what she did. We'll put it on record, self-defense." "There's nothing in her hand," the bald one said quickly, already looking around as if the shadows of the houses might conceal witnesses. His eyes darted from the windows to the corners, trying to measure how much of this had been seen. "Damn it, Why'd she move like that? She resisted, the other repeated firmly, as though saying it enough times would transform it into truth. Keep filming. We'll say she reached into her bag. She was aggressive. She attacked. He crouched briefly to kick her sports bag further into the gutter, scattering the remaining notebooks like a stage tableau. Lacey stirred faintly, a shallow, broken gasp tearing from her throat. Her body trembled as if rejecting the weight of death pressing down on her. The movement startled the officers. The mustached one swore under his breath, the phone trembling in his hand as he caught the feeble twitch of her fingers on camera. She's still alive, he whispered. Not for long, the bald one replied coldly, holstering his weapon. He looked down at her with the clinical detachment of someone who had already rewritten the story in his mind. To him, she was no longer a child, not even a victim. She was a threat that had been neutralized. The faint rasp of her breathing filled the void, each sound weaker than the last. Lacey's eyes fluttered, her gaze unfocused, searching desperately for something beyond the looming figures above her. She thought of her mother, of the strength in her voice, of the promise of dinner waiting at home, of the smell of the kitchen and the warmth of being safe. She tried to form words to call out, but blood choked her voice. The mustached officer crouched beside her, phone still recording, his free hand hovering uncertainly over the wound in her chest. For a second, something human flickered across his features, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Don't move, sweetheart, he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy that rang hollow against the coldness in his eyes. Help's on the way. No, it isn't, the bald one snapped. Not until we get this straight. No calls yet. We need to control this. The street remained deserted. Curtains twitched in the distance, but no one stepped outside. Fear held the neighbors in their homes, the memory of past nights when sirens came and questions led nowhere. The mustached officer leaned closer, tilting his phone so that the girl's face filled the screen. Say something, he murmured, almost gleeful. Tell them how you resisted. He pushed her shoulder roughly. Say it. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The phone captured only a gurgle, a faint bubble of blood. The officer frowned, then laughed nervously to himself. Guess she's not cooperating. The bald officer turned sharply. Enough! Put that damn phone down! But the other shook his head. No, this is evidence. This proves she was alive. This proves we tried. He zoomed in on her trembling hand, on her face paling beneath a thin layer of dirt and blood. They'll believe it. Rage flickered across his partner's features. He grabbed the phone for a second, pulling it down, but then released it, realizing too late that they were already in too deep. The narrative had to be controlled, and the video would be the anchor of their defense. They would paint her as a delinquent, a threat, someone who provoked them. Another shallow breath rattled from Lacey's chest. Her eyes shifted slightly, focusing for the briefest instant on something beyond the officers, something moving at the far end of the street. Footsteps, fast and heavy, were pounding closer. The officers hadn't noticed yet. They were too busy staging the scene. The mustached one crouched lower, pressing a hand to the girl's shoulder as though restraining her. Stop resisting, he said again for the camera. Louder this time. His voice echoed unnaturally in the empty street, a grotesque performance for an unseen audience. The bald one kicked her scattered notebooks, muttering curses under his breath, piecing together a version of events in his head. She went for the bag. She wouldn't listen. She made me fear for my life, he rehearsed. He glanced back at his partner. Get this on tape. Say it. Yeah, the mustached one said, his grin returning like a mask slipping back into place. Say it to the camera. Repeat it. They'll eat it up in court. The bald one turned, staring straight into the glowing lens of the phone. His voice was calm, even rehearsed as he spoke. The suspect resisted arrest. She reached into her bag in a threatening manner. I believed she had a weapon. I discharged my firearm in self-defense. Behind him, Lacey's breaths came slower, each one shallower, weaker. The words she heard made no sense to her, not in that moment, not as her body faltered under the weight of pain. The voices of the men above her blurred into a meaningless hum. What mattered was the sound approaching now, the pounding footsteps growing louder, the the shadow stretching longer across the pavement. Her lips parted again, blood coating her teeth. This time a single word escaped, barely audible, a final plea carried on a breath too thin to last. "Mom!" The officers froze, their heads snapping up at the same time. The mustached one's phone tilted, catching in its lens a figure sprinting toward them with a speed that made the air itself seem to break apart. A figure whose face was twisted, not with confusion, but with a fury so raw it was almost animal. The camera caught it all. The mother racing into view, her eyes locked on the bleeding body of her daughter, her arms pumping like pistons, her voice erupting in a scream that shattered the eerie quiet of the street. The moment of escalation had already passed. The moment of reckoning was about to begin. The scream that tore through the street did not sound like anything human. It was raw, unrestrained, the kind of cry that could only come from a soul ripped open in an instant. The officers' heads turned sharply, their hands tightening instinctively around their weapons, but even they felt the shock of it tremble in their bones. Down the length of the block, a figure came into view, running with such ferocity that the ground seemed to quake beneath her. Ronda Rousey's face was carved with anguish, her eyes wide with horror as they locked on the small, crumpled body lying on the asphalt. The sight of her daughter's pale hair streaked with blood shattered the world she had built, a world where strength could protect, where discipline could prevent chaos. She dropped the bag she carried, its contents spilling unheeded onto the pavement. She could not even feel her lungs burn from the sprint. She felt only the searing pain in her chest that no physical blow had ever managed to inflict. Her daughter lay there, fragile and still, and around her stood the men who had done this. They didn't look like protectors, not to Ronda. They looked like executioners standing over their victim, rehearsing excuses. She fell to her knees beside Lacey, her hands trembling as she reached for the girl's face. Baby, it's me," she whispered, though her voice cracked so violently it was hardly recognizable. She brushed strands of blood-matted hair away from her daughter's forehead, searching desperately for breath, for a pulse, for anything. Lacey's chest rose faintly, then fell again, her lips parting in a ghost of a whisper. "Mom!" The word slipped out like a final breath, a fragile thread connecting life to the edge of death. No, don't you dare!" Ronda gasped. She pressed her hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, though she knew it was useless. "Stay with me, Lacey. Please, baby, please stay with me." Tears blurred her vision, and the metallic scent of blood filled her nostrils, burning like acid. Her mind screamed at her to call for help, but her body refused to move away. Every instinct she had was to hold her daughter close, to shield her, to keep her safe even now. The officers exchanged a glance. The mustached one, still clutching the phone, pointed it slightly lower as if to catch both mother and child in the frame. His smirk was gone, replaced by unease, but the act of filming had become second nature. The bald officer's jaw tightened as he stepped forward, his voice harsh. "Ma'am, step away. You're interfering with a police investigation." Ronda looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, and in that moment her grief hardened into something else. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice dropped into a low growl that sent chills through the man standing above her. "You shot my daughter." "She resisted," the bald officer said quickly, his words sharp, defensive. "She reached for something. We had no choice." "She's 14, Ronda spat, her voice trembling with rage. "She was walking home from school, and you put a bullet in her chest." The mustached officer tried to intervene, his tone oily. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss, but if you continue to interfere, we'll have to restrain you, for your safety and ours." "For my safety?" Ronda repeated slowly, her hands curling into fists. She felt the warmth of her daughter's blood seeping into her skin, soaking her clothes, and the fury inside her swelled until it eclipsed everything else. She rose from the ground with a fluidity that came not from thought but from instinct, the same instinct honed over decades of training. The grief did not leave her, it fused with her strength, becoming something far more dangerous. The officer saw the change in her posture and shifted uneasily. "Don't do anything stupid," the bald one warned, his hand drifting toward the holster at his side. "I'll shoot if I have to." "You already have," she hissed. Her gaze cut through him like a blade. The mustached officer lifted his phone higher, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of some grotesque desire to document what he thought would be another incident. His voice shook as he barked, "Ma'am, on the ground, now!" Ronda didn't move. She stood tall, her body a fortress of muscle and control, but her face was the picture of devastation. She looked at the men who had destroyed her life in the span of seconds, and she felt something inside her snap. She had lived her entire life by rules of the mat, rules of the ring, rules of society, discipline, restraint, control. But here, in the middle of a quiet street, those rules had failed her. They had not protected her daughter. The bald officer lunged forward, reaching for her arm, intending to pull her away from the body. It was a mistake. The moment his hand closed around her wrist, her body reacted faster than thought. In one fluid motion, she pivoted, using his momentum against him. The sound of his body hitting the asphalt reverberated like thunder. He groaned, stunned, his breath knocked out of him. But Ronda was already turning to the other. The mustached officer fumbled, his phone still recording as his free hand moved for his weapon. Ronda's foot shot upward, striking his wrist with the precision of a master. The gun clattered to the pavement, spinning out of reach. His cry of pain was cut short as her elbow slammed into his jaw, sending him staggering backward. The phone flew from his hand, skittering across the ground but continuing to record, its unblinking eye capturing every second. The bald officer tried to rise, wheezing, but Ronda was faster. Her knee pressed into his back, pinning him down as her arm locked around his. With a brutal twist, she forced his shoulder into an unnatural angle, his scream piercing the night. "You think you can take my child from me?" she shouted, her voice breaking under the weight of her grief. "You think you can erase her with lies?" The other officer stumbled toward her, dazed, his mouth bleeding from the impact of her strike. "Stop!" he shouted hoarsely, his hand outstretched as if to push her away. "You're making it worse." "Worse?" Ronda turned her head slowly, her eyes wild with fury. "You murdered her. There is nothing worse." Neighbors began to appear at windows now, their silhouettes faint behind curtains. A few braver souls stepped onto porches, phones in hand, recording, whispering to one another. The scene was no longer hidden. Witnesses multiplied with every second, their lenses pointed at the woman kneeling over a cop, her hands breaking him down piece by piece. The mustached officer's voice cracked with desperation. "People are watching. Think about what you're doing." "I am," Ronda said, and there was no tremor in her voice this time. Her grip tightened on the bald officer's arm, the sound of bones grinding filling the air. He screamed again, but she didn't relent. She only stared at the other, daring him to come closer. And still, through it all, her daughter lay behind her, unmoving, the fragile body that had once been her world, now reduced to silence. Every sound Ronda made, every strike, every growl of fury came from that loss. She was no longer simply a fighter or a mother. She had become something else entirely, something born of love, grief, and wrath intertwined. The bald officer's voice cracked under the pressure of her hold. "You're under arrest," he wheezed, though the words were hollow, pathetic. Ronda bent lower, her lips near his ear, her voice quiet but deadly. "No," she whispered. "You are." Her daughter's blood still soaked her hands, warm and sticky against her skin. Her heart pounded like a drum of war. Around them, the crowd was growing. The moment was no longer theirs alone. The world would see. The scream of sirens rose faintly in the distance, a reminder that time was short, that more uniforms would soon arrive to twist the story further. But for now, in this breathless moment between tragedy and retribution, Ronda Rousey stood as both executioner and witness, her cry still echoing through the street, a mother's lament transformed into a promise of vengeance. The bald officer's scream still echoed across the street when Ronda released his mangled arm and rose to her feet. Her chest heaved with fury, and for a brief moment her gaze shifted back to the still body of her daughter, lying a few feet away. The sight stabbed deeper than any blade could, twisting inside her like a shard of glass. She wanted to fall beside Lacey again, to cradle her, to weep and plead for life to return. But another force pushed harder inside her, an unstoppable storm that refused to let her collapse. The storm was rage, sharpened into the steel edge of purpose. The mustached officer scrambled back, his mouth bloodied, one hand pressed against his swollen jaw. His eyes darted wildly between his fallen partner and the woman advancing toward him. He had seen fighters before, had even watched Ronda on television years ago, though he had mocked her then, dismissing mixed martial arts as a spectacle. But now, in the dim light of a quiet street, he recognized that nothing on those screens could capture the fury of a grieving mother whose daughter's blood still stained her hands. He fumbled at his belt, trying to unclip the taser, but his fingers shook so badly that he dropped it onto the ground. Ronda moved with terrifying precision, every step measured, every breath controlled. She did not rush, because she didn't need to. She knew her body better than she had ever known anything, and she felt the years of training surge through her muscles as naturally as breath itself. When she reached him, he swung at her clumsily in desperation, but she slipped beneath his arm, hooked her shoulder under his, and sent him sprawling onto the hood of his own patrol car. The metal dented with a hollow clang as his body crashed against it. He slid to the ground groaning, stunned, but she was already on him, her knee driving into his chest to pin him. "Look at me," she demanded, her voice guttural, primal. He tried to avert his eyes, but she grabbed his chin, forcing him to stare into her fury. "You wanted a show? You wanted this on film? You're going to remember every second of what you did." The bald officer was crawling now, trying to drag himself to his knees despite the agony coursing through his arm. He reached toward the weapon lying a few feet away, but Ronda saw him and moved faster than thought. She released the mustached one just long enough to snatch the gun with a swift kick, sending it skittering further down the street, far out of his reach. She pivoted back, striking him with a spinning back elbow that cracked against his temple and dropped him once more. The small crowd of neighbors at their windows had grown. Some stood openly on porches, filming with trembling hands. A few gasped and whispered, unsure whether to cheer or to scream. But none of them moved forward. They understood instinctively that this was not theirs to interrupt. This was a reckoning between a mother and the men who had taken her child. The bald officer groaned, his voice slurred as he staggered upright, cradling his broken arm. His partner wheezed from the pavement, coughing, still dazed from the blow. Ronda stood between them and the body of her daughter, her stance wide, balanced, an immovable sentinel. "Stay down," she warned, though the low growl of her voice carried no mercy. But arrogance dies slowly in men drunk on power. The bald one sneered through the pain, spitting blood onto the ground. "You think this makes you right? You think they'll see you as anything but a criminal? You'll rot in a cell, bitch." The words sliced into her, but not in the way he intended. They did not instill fear. They fed the storm inside her. She took one long stride forward, her hands shooting out to seize the front of his uniform. In a blur, she executed a perfect hip throw, slamming him onto the asphalt with such force that the air burst from his lungs. He gagged, eyes bulging, and before he could recover, she dropped into a mounted position and locked his arm between her legs. The crowd flinched at the sound that followed, a sickening crack as his elbow bent the wrong way. His scream was animalistic, echoing against the walls of the houses like the cry of something being hunted. The mustached officer tried to crawl away, clutching his ribs, his phone still lying somewhere nearby, recording from a skewed angle. Ronda turned on him, her face streaked with sweat and tears, and advanced. He raised a trembling hand, babbling through broken teeth. "Please, stop. I didn't mean—" Her fist cut through his words, striking his mouth and silencing him in a burst of blood and fractured enamel. He fell flat, stunned, and she caught his wrist, twisting until he howled. With merciless efficiency, she locked his arm and wrenched, another sickening pop resounding into the night. He rolled on the ground shrieking, clutching his ruined limb. "You took her from me," Ronda snarled, her voice loud enough for everyone watching to hear. "And you thought there would be no price." She stood tall again, her chest heaving, her hands shaking with rage and bloodlust. For a moment she closed her eyes, hearing only the pounding of her heart. She had spent her life using these skills for glory, for sport, for honor. But tonight, they were no longer sport. They were justice. The officers lay broken, writhing, reduced to pathetic shells of the authority they had wielded moments before. The neighbors filming had no words, only the unshakable awareness that history was unfolding before them. Sirens still wailed in the distance, growing closer, but Ronda did not care. The storm inside her had only begun. She turned once more to her daughter's body. Her knees threatened to buckle, grief pulling at her, even through the haze of rage. But she refused to collapse yet. She reached down, brushing her fingers across Lacey's cooling cheek, whispering words too quiet for the crowd to hear. Her tears fell freely, soaking into the child's blood, binding grief and fury together in an unbreakable bond. When she rose again, she was no longer just Ronda Rousey, the fighter, the champion, or even the mother. She was something beyond, something terrifying, something unstoppable. She faced the officers once more, their groans filling the street, and she knew in her heart that what she had done was not enough. Not yet. The retribution had only just begun. The air was trembling with echoes of screams, groans, and the sharp metallic scent of blood mingled with the faint perfume of freshly cut grass from the lawns surrounding the quiet neighborhood. Ronda stood in the middle of the street, her chest rising and falling with the ragged rhythm of a storm that had not yet passed. She could still hear her daughter's voice somewhere deep inside, a memory replaying on a loop, mocking her with the impossibility of turning back time. The men sprawled around her were not enough. They were broken, their arms twisted, their power stripped away, but her fury had not been sated. Destruction had only begun to seep from her soul, and the dam was far from empty. The bald officer writhed on the ground, clutching his mangled arm and gasping in disbelief. The authority he had wrapped himself in for years shattered like glass beneath Ronda's hands. His partner, his face swollen and lips split, lay groaning with every shallow breath, his ruined arm bent at an unnatural angle. Their eyes, once sharp and brimming with arrogant power, now looked up at her with the horror of men who had finally discovered what it meant to be powerless. And yet, even in their pain, Ronda could see flickers of the same old arrogance. The belief that the badge would shield them, that the system would sweep in to protect them, that they would remain untouchable no matter what. She stepped closer, her boots crunching against fragments of glass from the shattered patrol car mirror. Her shadow stretched long and jagged beneath the yellow glow of the street lamps, draping itself across the broken bodies of the officers like a cloak of judgment. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the immense force she was barely containing inside. She bent low, grabbing the bald officer by his collar and yanking him upright with strength that felt inhuman. He screamed, his arm flopping uselessly at his side. She pulled him so close that he could feel her breath against his face, and her eyes blazed like fire. "You laughed while you hurt her," she growled. "You mocked her pain. You wanted to record it and share it like a trophy. Do you feel powerful now?" He stammered, his words garbled by blood and fear. But before he could answer, she drove her forehead into his nose. The crunch was wet and final, and he howled as blood sprayed across his face. She released him and he collapsed back to the asphalt, choking on his own agony. The crowd that had gathered shuddered, phones trembling in their hands as they recorded. No one dared step closer, no one dared intervene, not even to plead with her. The spectacle unfolding before them was beyond ordinary violence. It was something deeper, something raw, something that felt like justice stripped of its disguise. The mustached officer moaned weakly, trying to drag himself toward the gutter, as though distance could save him. Ronda turned to him, her eyes narrowing, and in 3 strides she was on him. She stomped down hard on his hand, the crack of bones shattering echoing across the street. His scream was high-pitched, breaking into a sob. She crouched over him, her fist slamming once into his jaw. Then again, then again. Each blow was precise, controlled, delivered with the mechanical efficiency of years spent perfecting her craft. Blood splattered onto the pavement, staining her knuckles, streaking down her arm. Still she did not stop. She seized his head, pressing his face against the cold asphalt, her voice low and trembling with venom. You pointed your gun at my baby. You pulled the trigger on her innocence. You laughed at her fear. Now tell me, what does it feel like to be the one begging?" His words came out broken, desperate. "Please, I'm sorry, please, stop. I didn't mean—" The plea only sharpened the blade inside her. She wrenched his head back, dragging him by the hair, and hurled him against the side of the patrol car. His skull thudded against the metal, leaving a dent. He slid down, dazed, his mouth opening and closing as blood gushed from his split scalp. The bald one tried to crawl again, whimpering, his breath ragged. Ronda pivoted, striding toward him, her hands flexing as though itching to finish what she had started. She yanked him by the ankle, dragging him across the rough asphalt like a predator, pulling prey back into its lair. He cried out, his skin scraping raw against the pavement. She pinned him with her knee across his chest, her face hovering inches above his. "You thought you were untouchable," she hissed. "You thought no one would ever make you pay. Tonight you learn what justice really feels like." She gripped his broken arm and twisted. The scream that erupted from his throat pierced the night, silencing even the whispers from the crowd. His eyes rolled back, but she smacked his face, keeping him conscious. "No," she spat. "You don't get to escape into the dark. You stay here. You feel it all." The mustached officer coughed violently, spitting blood, trying to crawl again with his remaining strength. She left the bald one moaning beneath her knee and stalked back to the other, her presence so overwhelming that even the neighbors holding their phones felt themselves trembling, though her fury was not directed at them. She grabbed the mustached man by his collar and hurled him into the hood of the car once more. His body collapsed across the metal like a rag doll, and she slammed his head down hard enough to shatter the windshield. Glass rained down, sparkling in the streetlight, mingling with blood as he slid helplessly to the ground. For a long moment she stood there, breathing heavily, her fists dripping with crimson, her hair wild, her face twisted in anguish and fury. Around her, silence reigned except for the whimpers of the broken men at her feet. The crowd dared not cheer, dared not flee. They were transfixed, unable to look away from the destruction she had wrought. And yet Ronda did not feel triumph. The fire in her chest was still roaring, demanding more, screaming that these men's suffering could never equal the life they had stolen. She felt hollow even as she looked down at their broken forms. Their bones snapped, their blood spilled, but Lacey would never laugh again, never train in the gym again, never hug her mother again. Her gaze fell once more on her daughter's still form lying in the street. The sight ripped through her, but it also anchored her, reminding her that this destruction was only the beginning. These two were not enough. They were pawns, yes, cruel and vile, but pawns in a greater machine that had let them believe they could destroy lives without consequence. The machine was still alive, humming in every precinct, protected by every uniform, fed by every lie. And Ronda knew as she stood in the wreckage of this night that her war had only just begun. In the distance, sirens grew louder, red and blue lights flashing closer. The crowd murmured nervously, some scattering back into their houses, others holding their phones even higher. The broken officers groaned, their moans pitiful now, but the oncoming roar of backup signaled that more would arrive soon. Ronda lifted her head, her blood-stained face catching the glow of the streetlight. She did not run, not yet. She wanted them to see her, to see what a mother could become when her child was stolen from her. She wanted them to look at the destruction she had left behind and understand that nothing, not badges, not guns, not the weight of an entire system would ever stop her now. The sirens wailed louder, swallowing the night. Ronda turned toward the sound, her body still coiled with fury, ready to face whatever came next. She knew she would not stop, not until the world felt the same pain she carried, not until every last man who thought he was untouchable tasted the destruction that now pulsed in her veins. The storm had not ended. It was only gathering strength. The red and blue lights broke the silence of the night long before the engines roared into the neighborhood. The distant echo of sirens had grown into a deafening chorus, surrounding the street from every direction, a net closing tighter with each passing second. Ronda stood in the middle of the carnage, her fists dripping with blood, her body trembling with exhaustion that refused to stop her. Around her lay the shattered remains of the two officers who had murdered her daughter, moaning weakly, their power stripped away, their arrogance dissolved into sobs and broken bones. And yet the weight pressing down on Ronda was heavier than any victory could carry. Lacey's body still lay motionless on the pavement. Every breath Ronda drew was poisoned by the sight. Every second stretched into eternity, and the storm within her grew sharper as the reinforcements arrived. The first squad car screeched to a halt at the corner, its headlights blinding, its doors flying open with a synchronized violence that betrayed no hesitation. Then another car, and another, until the quiet suburban street looked like a battlefield about to be swallowed whole by the system's wrath. Uniforms spilled into the night, guns already drawn, their shouts echoing against the houses. "On the ground! Hands where we can see them!" The commands were barked with such urgency that the neighbors, still holding their phones, flinched as though the words had been aimed at them. Ronda did not flinch. She did not kneel. She stood, her hands lowered but loose, her chest rising and falling like that of a predator ready to lunge. The officers fanned out in a semicircle, their guns aimed, their flashlights cutting through the dark to pin her in the center of the street. Behind them, more vehicles arrived, the air filling with static from radios and the shuffling boots of men who had already decided what she was, a threat to be neutralized. She raised her eyes to meet them, her jaw tightening. Her voice carried across the tense silence, cracked with grief, but sharpened into something like steel. "They murdered my daughter." The words struck like a whip, freezing even some of the officers for a brief heartbeat. Her face glistened with sweat and tears, her blood-stained fists trembling. "You think I'm the criminal here? You stand with men who shot a child in the street and laughed while she bled, and you point your weapons at me?" For a moment hesitation flickered among the line of uniforms. Some exchanged uncertain glances, their fingers tightening on triggers but not pulling. The sight of the two broken officers on the ground was undeniable. The recording phones at the windows a constant reminder that every word, every bullet, could be immortalized. Yet the voice of command cut through the uncertainty like a blade. A sergeant stepped forward, his expression carved from stone, his voice amplified by a megaphone. "Ronda Rousey, you are under arrest for assaulting law enforcement officers. Drop to your knees, place your hands on your head, or we will use force." The words rang with practiced authority, but Ronda laughed, a hollow, jagged sound that carried no humor. "Force?" she spat. "What more force can you bring than the one that already stole my child?" She took a step forward, and the circle of officers flinched in unison, guns snapping upward as if choreographed. Neighbors gasped, a few ducking behind fences, though most continued to film with trembling hands. The tension crackled, thick enough to choke, as the night seemed to hold its breath. The sergeant barked again, his tone sharper now. "Final warning, surrender now." But surrender had been stripped from Ronda the moment Lacey's heart stopped. She shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving the man in charge. "You want me to kneel," she said, her voice calm now, eerily calm, the calm of a woman who had already lost everything. "You want me to bow to the same badge that killed my little girl?" "No, not tonight. Tonight you kneel before me." And then the storm broke. Ronda moved with an explosion of speed that defied the officer's expectations. She sprinted toward the nearest car before the line could adjust, using the bulk of the vehicle as cover against the immediate spray of bullets that shattered windows and sent sparks flying from the asphalt. Glass rained down, and the neighbors screamed, ducking into their homes at last. But many still held their phones high through cracks in doors and blinds, unwilling to let the world miss a second of what was unfolding. The officers shouted, spreading out, but Ronda was already on the move. She burst from behind the car, closing the distance to one of the younger policemen before he could steady his aim. She grabbed the barrel of his rifle, twisting with brutal precision, snapping his wrist and wrenching the weapon free. He cried out, collapsing to the ground, clutching his ruined hand. She hurled the rifle aside and drove her elbow into his chest, sending him sprawling unconscious onto the pavement. Another officer charged, baton raised, but Ronda sidestepped and swept his legs with a flawless throw, sending him crashing onto his back. She stomped on his chest, knocking the air from his lungs, then tore the baton from his grip and hurled it into the headlights of a squad car. The glass shattered, plunging half the street into deeper shadow. The line faltered. The officers had not expected her to fight, to charge into their ranks like a soldier cutting through enemy lines. Panic rippled through them, though training forced them to regroup quickly. More commands, more shouts, but the chaos of their own fear tangled their voices into confusion. Ronda ducked behind another car as bullets tore chunks from its frame. Her lungs burned, her body screaming from exhaustion, but she ignored it. Pain meant nothing now. All that mattered was showing them that she was no victim, no target, no grieving woman to be silenced. She was destruction incarnate, and the system itself would bleed tonight. As the officers tried to flank her, she leapt again, catching one by surprise and slamming him into the hood of his own car. His head cracked against the metal, leaving a dent, his gun clattering uselessly to the ground. She kneed him once, twice until he collapsed limp. Another aimed at her from behind, but she spun, disarming him with a ruthless twist of his arm before slamming her fist into his jaw. Blood sprayed from his mouth as he tumbled backward. The sergeant shouted orders frantically, but Ronda heard nothing but the thundering of her heart. She saw the flash of her daughter's smile in her mind, the sound of her laughter echoing like a ghost. Every strike she delivered was for Lacey. Every scream torn from an officer's throat was another echo of the agony that had consumed her. She had become a weapon forged in grief, and nothing could blunt her edge. Still, she was only one woman, and the system was endless. More sirens howled, more vehicles screeched into the neighborhood, and soon the street swarmed, with dozens of officers forming a new perimeter. Helicopter blades chopped the air above, bathing the scene in a harsh spotlight. The neighbors' recordings would spread across the world by morning, but the system did not care. The system had already decided the narrative. Ronda Rousey, fallen champion, unhinged criminal, cop killer. Pinned in the harsh white glare, Ronda stood again in the center of the chaos, her fists still clenched, her body covered in blood not all her own. Around her lay groaning men, some unconscious, some crippled, their weapons scattered across the pavement. The sergeant stepped forward once more. This time his voice tinged not with authority, but with fear masked as anger. "You can't win, Rousey. There are too many of us. Surrender, or we'll put you down." Her eyes lifted to the sky, where the helicopter's light blinded her, and then fell back to the circle of men surrounding her. She smiled, though it was not joy, but defiance. "You already put me down," she whispered. "When you killed my daughter, you killed everything I was. But what's left?" She spread her arms wide, her bloodied hands trembling in the glare. "What's left can't be killed." The officers tightened their circle, their weapons rising again as the command to fire trembled on the sergeant's lips. The storm had reached its peak, and the system had drawn its full strength against a single woman who refused to kneel. And still Ronda did not bow. The night trembled beneath the unrelenting roar of the helicopter blades. Its blinding spotlight pinned Ronda like prey on an open field. But she stood tall, unflinching, her shadow stretching long and dark across the broken street. Around her, the scattered officers groaned, clutching shattered arms, bleeding faces, broken pride. The air stank of sweat, metal, gasoline, and the sharp sting of blood. Sirens screamed from every direction, more cars flooding in, more uniforms forming a living wall of blue and black, their weapons raised in perfect unison. The system had bared its teeth. The circle was closing. But Ronda did not kneel. She could not. Kneeling would mean surrender, and surrender had been torn from her the instant a bullet tore through her daughter's chest. She glanced once toward Lacey's body, lying where she had fallen, the pale strands of her hair glowing ghost-like under the artificial light. That image fused into Ronda's heart like molten iron. It was the last anchor of her humanity, the last reason for her fury, the last truth she would ever need. The sergeant barked through the megaphone again, his voice cracking under the weight of his own fear. "This is your last chance. Drop to your knees, hands on your head. Do it now." Ronda's lips parted, her voice carrying easily across the tense air. "Last chance? she echoed. She laughed, and the sound was not hollow but terrifying, a laugh stripped of all warmth. You had your chance when you pointed a gun at a child. You had your chance when you pulled the trigger. That was your last chance. Her words sent ripples through the line of men. Some glanced at one another nervously, their fingers trembling against triggers. The crowd of neighbors, still filming from behind fences and half-shuttered windows, caught every word, every frame. The story the system hoped to spin was unraveling with each recording, light glowing red in the night. The sergeant snarled, lifting a hand to signal the order. His mouth opened, but before the command could escape, Ronda moved. She exploded into motion with the fury of a storm, charging at the nearest cluster of officers before their formation could adapt. Gunfire erupted, bullets sparking off the metal of cars as she dove behind them, rolling and rising in a fluid motion that belonged more to a predator than a woman. She closed the distance to the first man, wrenching his rifle upward so the muzzle spat harmless fire into the air, then slammed her knee into his stomach. He folded, gasping, and she hurled him into two others like a battering ram. The circle broke, chaos surging like a wave. Shouts filled the air, the pounding of boots, the sharp crack of gunfire. But Ronda was already among them, moving too fast, striking too hard. Her elbow crashed into one officer's jaw, sending him spinning. She swept another off his feet with a flawless throw, the training of a lifetime igniting into merciless precision. She disarmed a third, twisted his wrist until it snapped, and flung his weapon into the gutter. "Get her down!" someone screamed, but fear coded the words. No one had ever fought like this. Not against them, not with such savage control. They were used to fear, to compliance, to the bowed heads of those who believed the badge was untouchable. But here was a woman who had nothing left to lose, and she was showing them what that looked like. The sergeant roared for order, rallying his men. But Ronda's voice cut across his commands, loud and sharp as a blade. "You wanted me on my knees? You'll be the ones kneeling tonight." Her fists hammered down again and again. One officer screamed as she wrenched his arm into an armbar, the sound of tearing ligaments echoing like a gunshot. Another choked as she trapped him in a chokehold, his eyes bulging before he slumped unconscious. She used every ounce of skill, every throw, every strike, every technique she had honed across decades. The mat had become asphalt, the octagon had become a street, and her opponents were no longer athletes. They were killers wearing uniforms. The helicopter roared overhead, its spotlight following her relentless path through the line of men. But every flash of light captured another moment of humiliation for the system, a woman dismantling its enforcers piece by piece, while the world watched through the lenses of dozens of phones. She was bleeding now, cuts along her arms, a graze from a bullet across her shoulder, bruises blooming across her ribs. But pain was irrelevant. Pain was fuel. Her daughter had felt worse in her final moments, and Ronda would feel it 1,000 times if it meant carrying this reckoning forward. Finally, she reached the sergeant. He stood his ground, baton raised, sweat gleaming on his brow. His voice faltered as he shouted, "Stop!" But it carried no weight. She was already on him, her hands seizing his wrist, twisting until the baton fell. She slammed him against the hood of a car, her forearm pressed across his throat. His eyes bulged as she leaned in, her voice low, venomous. "Say it," she hissed. "Say my daughter resisted. Say she deserved a bullet." He gagged, choking, clawing at her arm, but she only pressed harder. The crowd filming gasped, the line of officers frozen as if unsure whether to intervene or let the moment unfold. Ronda's teeth bared, her fury unmasked. "You point your guns at mothers and children, and you call yourselves protectors. Tonight, the world sees you for what you are." The sergeant's knees buckled, his eyes rolling. She released him at the last moment, letting him collapse onto the asphalt, gasping like a fish out of water. He clutched his throat, too weak to rise, his authority shattered with his body. The street had gone eerily silent. The officers still standing lowered their weapons, their confidence broken. They looked at the groaning bodies of their comrades, at the unconscious forms scattered across the pavement, and at the cameras recording from every angle. They saw not victory, but humiliation. They saw themselves undone by one woman's grief and wrath. Ronda turned slowly, her blood-stained face illuminated by the harsh glare of the helicopter. Her eyes locked on the lenses, not just the phones, but the hovering camera above, broadcasting this moment to all who would see it. She raised her arms, not in surrender, but in defiance, her voice cutting through the night like a verdict. "You killed my daughter, and tonight I showed you what justice feels like." Her words rang out, heavy, final, searing themselves into the air. She walked back toward Lacey's body, kneeling beside her again. Gently she gathered the small form into her arms, cradling her as if she could still protect her, as if the warmth of her embrace could bring back what had been stolen. The crowd watched in silence, the officers frozen, the helicopter hovering overhead. With her daughter in her arms, Ronda rose. She did not run. She did not hide. She walked slowly down the street, each step steady, each breath ragged but unbroken. Behind her lay the wreckage of uniforms and weapons, the broken machinery of a system that had believed itself untouchable. Ahead, the night stretched vast and uncertain, filled with the sirens of a future she no longer feared. And though the law would call her a criminal, though the system would hunt her, though her name would be dragged through mud and headlines, the people who had watched, who had recorded, who had seen the truth with their own eyes, would remember her differently. Not as a fugitive, not as a fighter, but as a mother who became vengeance, a mother who refused to kneel, a mother whose cry had become the reckoning of a nation. The night swallowed her footsteps as the helicopter's light struggled to keep up, and the crowd whispered in awe. Ronda Rousey had carried her daughter into the darkness, but she had left behind a fire that would not be extinguished. The final reckoning was not the end. It was the beginning of a war that would burn in every heart that had seen what justice truly looked like. Don't miss what happens next. Hit that subscribe button now and be the first to see our upcoming stories. Watch more of our shocking videos right here on the channel. And if this story shook you, share it with your friends so they can feel it too.